We're going to really quick take a look at some of the object operations for manipulation, grouping, and selection available within Vue. The first thing I want to show is a rather overlooked feature, which is the repeat operation subdivide and extrapolate. Very cool object copy manipulators. What I'm going to do is load in and create a sphere, and these operations work with copy and paste functions. The first we're going to take a look at is the subdivide. So what I want to do is copy and paste, Control C, Control V, create a duplicate of this sphere. And I'm just going to move the sphere just a little bit over on the x-axis. We'll go ahead and bring it up on the z. I'm also going to scale it, bring it down on all axes, and then stretching it out on the y-axis. Now, if we go up to the top, under Edit, we can select Repeat Operation Subdivide. It's going to give us an amount. This is a number of duplicates to go in between the copy operation to sort of create a linear effect, almost as if it was animated over time, seeing almost the frame rate. So let's use 10, the default. I'm just going to hit enter, and what we're going to see is all of these duplicates and then the slow change in scale to reach the end of the object. So that's a pretty cool feature. I'll go ahead and delete these. Another is the extrapolate, and what I'm going to do is copy and paste, move this sphere over a little and scale it just a little. We'll move it, scale it up. And now edit, repeat operation, extrapolate by 10 again. Hit enter. And now we're going to see the continued operation. So rather than going in between, it's going to continue with those settings, and in a sense doubling them every single time. So that creates a fairly interesting looking object. When you're working with pivot points, you can get an even more interesting effect. So what I'm going to do is create a new sphere. We're going to go to the numerics tab, select the pivot, which is all the way on the bottom, and now I'm going to adjust the pivot position with this little gizmo that we have here, moving it up on the Z, and we can see that the gizmo within the viewport is also changing, showing where the pivot is. We can also choose to show the pivot, so now we can see the original pivot position along with the new location. And if you want to reset it, you can select the Reset Pivot button, and you can also use a relative pivot, which is based on the position, whether or not it's relative to the object or the actual placement within the scene. So it's kind of a local versus global coordinate. What I'm going to do is select the rotation, and I'm going to use the rotation gizmo. First I'm going to copy and then paste, and now I'm going to rotate this. And then we can go ahead and scale it. Edit, repeat, operation, extrapolate. We'll use 10. And now we get a really interesting looking object. So you can create some pretty interesting effects with this. And another thing I haven't really covered is a Metablob object. Metablob is a grouped object. It works kind of like metaballs used to in some of the other applications, if you're familiar with other 3D applications. If we go over here on the left, we can create a metablob. This works with all forms of primitive objects within Vue. And what it'll do is kind of fuse them together. So they all become one mesh. So you can effectively actually model within Vue using metablobs, and in combination with the repeat operations, extrapolate and subdivide, you can create some pretty complex objects. When we double click on the Metablob, we get a few different options where we can adjust the envelope distance. We can see the effects showing up in the viewport, and then the intensity of the overall control. So we can see that showing up. And so that's all one new mesh. We can even go back in, select the object. If we have any of the expanded objects, we can go ahead and manipulate it further to change the Metablob and even animate that over time. So you can create some pretty neat effects, and this will work with any view primitive. So I'm going to add in a box and now move it into the Metablob group, and we can see that influencing and interacting with the Metablob object. So it works with all of the primitives. It does not work with terrains, anything like that. So just the main primary objects, using a plane or an alpha plane isn't really going to help you. So basically it would be the sphere, the cylinder, cube, pyramid, cone, or torus object. So we'll go ahead, we'll just really quick add in this torus, and then move it into the Metablob group. And now we can see that blending with the rest of this. Now, a really cool thing you can do, and I'm not going to spend all the time showing it, but if you want, you can save view primitives, right click, save the object, and then load it as an ecosystem instance in Paint. And then if you use the instance selector, you can convert them to objects and then create a Metablob. So it's essentially a way to paint Metablob objects, which is kind of cool. Another feature we have the ability to do, and this applies to all objects, is baking to polygons. If you right click, you can go bake to polygons, choose the bake quality, which we can see an estimated number of polygons and vertices. This number is typically wrong, and especially with terrains, it'll be really far off. The difference between 50% and 100% is almost exactly the same quality, especially with terrains. So now we have 7,000 polygons, and it said it was going to be a lot more than that. So you can usually go up pretty high. Right now the estimated number of polygons is 62,000, and when we bake it full quality, we get just under 9,000. You can also see that the quality overall is a lot of tearing, and in most cases it might be easier just to keep the object as a Metablob and not bake it. So it really depends on how you're going to be using it. Another thing that is tied to that, which I'll show really quick, since I'm on the subject of baking, is how it works with displacements. I haven't covered displacements yet, but we're going to take a look and just open the material and load in any of the fractals that are available for the bump channel. We'll use a terrain altitude. Go ahead and select steep cliffs, mountains. Turn on displacement mapping. I'm going to turn on reevaluate material after distribution. And first let's take a look and see how it is displacing the object. So I do need to have this a little smaller. So I'm going to open up the material, reduce the bump scale, which is the overall output. And now we have a little bit of a displacement on there. We can right click and bake to polygons. This will take into account the displacement and bake the object to match the displacement. So we'll be able to run displacement over objects and create some really interesting meshes. Now in this case, using the view primitive created a lot of distortion. And we can almost see the wireframe showing up. If you have access to other applications, what I suggest doing is performing some sort of subdivide metaform type process on a cube, if you wanted to have a sphere and importing that in, because the view primitives don't always look right. Right now, the displacement mapping does have a few tearing attributes, which tends to happen at the moment. Hopefully those will be fixed soon, and this will work a little bit better. But once we have a baked or a mesh object, there are polygon mesh options. So if we go to edit the object, and this applies to any imported object as well, we can set the smoothing angle and whether or not it's a double-sided mesh. We can also use the decimation. And there's also a dynamic subdivision, which will continually subdivide the polygons as the camera moves closer. And then there's a quality boost to increase the overall amount of subdivision quality. This is not a smooth subdivision. This is a direct subdivision. It just increases geometry so it won't smooth out the mesh. You can also access the illumination baking options. So if you want to bake radiosity onto objects, this is also where you access those commands. You can invert the normals if needed, and if you import a material where the polygon surfaces have different materials, you can split those objects from each other based on the polygon material selection. When you change the smoothing angle, it will smooth the mesh, and it can take a second sometimes to process. We can see right now, because of the quality setting I had, this mesh is actually 1.5 million polygons. A little high for what it actually looks like. So you might even end up getting a better mesh just by using a lower quality. There's another option I want to show you. I'm just going to create a standard terrain, copy and paste it. I'm just going to move it over to the side. Anytime you copy and paste an object and not really manipulate it, and then you go to the library tab, you get a master object. This allows you to manipulate these objects together. If we move to local coordinate, we can independently scale and move them. Since it is a master object, they will both scale equally. If you're in the global mode, it automatically treats it as a group. If you go down to the bottom, there are two options. One is to edit the master object, which is going to allow us to manipulate, in this case, a terrain object, and apply that transformation to both objects. And then we can also use the master object addition mode. This separates the terrain and gives us sort of a preview to use to manipulate both of these objects. This is just a temporary object, what would be considered a proxy. And once we click off of it, it is removed from the scene. I'm going to go ahead and delete these and go ahead and select or create a sphere. And I'm just going to copy and paste and really quick just run that repeat operation subdivide just to get some different objects in here. And just kind of move some of them around. A really nice selection technique. So now you can click and drag to select all of these objects. But let's say you just want one of them, but they're all kind of scattered together. It might be difficult to really pick one out if they're overlapping. Well, when you have a grouped selection like this, you can hit the Tab key to walk through the selection. And that makes it a little bit easier to pick out an object. So if we wanted to select one of these, but I wasn't sure which one, because sometimes they overlap, and as you can see with the gizmo, without hiding it, then I don't have to turn off gizmos. And that only works when you have multiple selections. It will just go through which ones were initially selected and selected within the viewport, I might add. Because if we select them within the layers, it does not work. Unless you would have to rotate the camera and sort of initiate the view. Otherwise, you're using the tab key within the navigator or the object layering. I also want to show you that you can sort by a lot of different methods, by type, sizes, names, and then also set up your layers if you want to create different layers. And I did just delete those, but I'm going to bring them back. Another option you have is to group objects. If you wanted them all to be part of one main object, grouping is pretty straightforward. No editing options, it's just kind of creating a stack of objects you can group together. So you can modify them independently. If you want to expand the group, you can go in. Otherwise, selecting the group itself, if you were to scale this with the global option, it's going to scale it all as one group. We switch to local, it's also basically the same because it is a grouped object. If we remove it or ungroup, which we can see the button for over here on the left, and now we switch to local, we can scale them independently or switching to the global mode all at once. View does also allow Boolean operations, the ability to intersect and cut objects out. I'm just going to grab a couple of spheres here, create them, and what we can do is click on the Boolean, and if you click and hold down, it'll open up all the options where you can select a difference, a union, or the intersection. So a difference would be cutting out one object from the other, and this will depend on the placement of these objects within the group, because it does act as a group. You can ungroup it, go ahead and select the union, which is sort of a grouping and just basically a standard group. But the option is there if you want to act as a Boolean, because it will react differently on the inside of the object, where the intersection is now removed. And the easiest way to really see this is if I load in a transparent material for the object. So we're going to go to liquids, or actually we'll go to glasses, select the standard glass, and I'm going to create a copy of this object, ungroup it, and just group it together. And you'll be able to see the difference between, and it's basically the intersection of the geometry is removed when you're using a Boolean rather than just grouping them together. And I'm going to ungroup this Boolean, and the last one we have is the intersection, which is just going to do the opposite of the union and just leave the intersected areas of the object. So we could also bake this to polygons and create an object from that. Switch that over to the wireframe, and now we can see that object. So it is a way to create different types of objects. And you can change the displays up here in the aspect tab just under load the material through all the different previews. You can also lock the object, hide it, or only show it in the main view. Some additional selection options that are available. And I'm just going to add a few objects into the scene, some different primitives. And go ahead and just copy and paste all of these. Kind of move them around. If we go over to the left, this is sort of a filter. So what I'm going to do is select all of these objects, and actually I do need to only have one object for this. First I'll select just this bottom cone, and if we go over here on the left, we can see this icon becomes active. If I click and hold down, we're going to see a couple of different options. Select by wireframe color, object material, and object type. So if I want to select that all the cones in the scene, I can select the object type, and now every cone will be selected. So it's initiated by the initial selection. All the wireframe colors will be the same at this point. So if I select by wireframe color, it's going to do every object in the scene, and they also still have the same material. So let's go ahead and select these two objects, load in a different material, and we'll do that glass, and also give a different wireframe color. So it doesn't just have to be that automatic color, we can assign it to some of the presets. So now we can select by wireframe color, and they both have the same wireframe color. Maybe we'll add the other one to it as well. So if we select by wireframe color, all three of these, if we just want to select all of the objects with that same material, select the material option, now it's just these two. So those are some really helpful ways to sort through some of the objects in the scene. We also have some alignment operations. If we click, there is an alignment tool, and this is a dynamic tool that allows us to align objects on different axes based on a couple of different commands. And if you want to cancel it, you really can't. You would have to set the objects back to the default setting, but otherwise you can just undo, Control Z to undo, or edit and undo, and then you don't have to worry about losing all that information. And another operation I want to show you, a really handy tool, is the drop object. What I'm going to do is just create a terrain and just load in a tree. And now sometimes the placement of these trees might be around the scene kind of randomly up in the air. If you go over here to on the lower left of all of the object manipulators, we have, if you left click, it's the drop object, right click is smart drop. So if I left click, it's going to drop the object and place it on top of whatever object is underneath it. So if I was to place this just above the terrain, drop it, it's going to end up right on one of the peaks. And a lot of the times this is related to where the pivot location is, but it is a really nice way to align different plants. You could even perform different copy operations, drop them all onto a terrain. So if you wanted to, let's go ahead and copy and paste, and then we'll subdivide that by 10, drop all these objects, and they're all going to conform to the terrain independently. Now the smart drop works a little bit differently. I'm going to add a couple of items to the scene, create a box, and I'll just go ahead and copy and paste, move it up, scale it, and offset its position slightly. So if I right click, it's going to be the smart drop object, right click, and we can see it's going to pretty closely align it. In this case, we'll go ahead and undo that. I'm going to drop this box first, and I'm going to rotate this a little more, smart drop, and it pretty much lands how it should for the most part. It's a pretty cool operation. So that way you can create different objects, and if you want to stack them a little more accurately, you can use the smart drop command. Kind of cool. There's another operation where we can flip the vertical or horizontal axis. It's not really going to show up too much with this object, but those tools are available. Not always needed, but they are there if you ever run into an occurrence where you need to perform an operation like that. Another, and the last thing I'm going to show, is the scatter and replicate object. I'm going to load a tree into the scene, and up at the top, right next to where we have copy and paste, there's the ability to duplicate, which is just going to create a copy. Or if you right click, it's going to be open the scatter replicate objects. We can generate how many copies we want, type in 20. We can do with variations. We can choose to move the copies by a certain amount on each axis. So let's go ahead and set a little bit on the X, a little on the Y. We can rotate these copies on different axes, use X and Y. We can also rescale them. And as I was saying before, the twist is really a skew. And actually I will show that just after I'm done using this tool, because that is kind of important. You can also scatter the objects if you choose to use the scatter. So now it's going to scatter, replicate these objects, create variations if needed. And it looks like a little bit of a display error here. Might just need to wait a sec for it to refresh. And that initial run I did end up crashing, so I just kind of re-ran it again with just 10 and not as much manipulation. But we can see it is a pretty neat way to be able to duplicate and copy objects. So we can go through and take a look and see that it hasn't entirely used the solid growth. So you might need to go in, if you're going to be doing a plant, and edit the object, grow a new plant. But it still can be a very useful tool. Now I did want to show that twist command, which is skew. So it just created a box, and if we open up the numerics tab, go to twist, we can now choose an axis, and what it's going to do is skew the object, because it is really, it's sort of twisting, but there's no rotation or any clear twisting. It's really a skew. But this can be applied to all objects, including terrains. So one thing you could do, we'll go ahead and raise up this terrain, just using a standard, and I'm going to twist it. And now we can see that it's starting to overlap. And I also want to note that once you perform this operation, in a twist operation, you're typically done with the tool. Trying to manipulate it and doing it again is going to just mess things up, as you just saw. Even undoing, let's see, and at this point I can't even undo the operation. So it is something that once you do it, if you are going to be using this tool, do it once, get it right the first time, because other than that, there's not much you can do after that point. So if I twist this again, one thing I can do to manipulate it further is if I switch to the local coordinate, I can scale on the coordinate system. But going back and trying to twist it again is just going to reset all of the vectors for rotation and cause a lot of issues. I also want to note that when you're using the global mode on a rotated object and then you go to scale it, it is effectively twisting it automatically. So if I load in another terrain, just rotate this around, since it's now using a global coordinate, it is effectively twisting and performing that same sort of operation. So it does automatically apply and create a twist command. But like I was saying, it's really more of a skew.